Okay, let me try and advance my next slide and see if this works. There we go. Our agenda, you can read for yourself, but I'll just review the objectives that were sent out ahead of time, which is that by the end of the webinar, you'll be able to identify what are typical and atypical childhood sexual behaviors. You'll be able to recognize the ways that culture might play into shaping individual children's sexual behavior. You'll be able to distinguish normal childhood curiosity from behaviors that may be sexually concerning. We're going to address some of the myths and facts about how sexual behavior may be mistaken, if you will, for sexual abuse or consistent with sexual abuse. And that part of our conversation will continue on Thursday's webinar. And finally, we're going to identify briefly some of the developmental changes in adolescence which impact decision-making related to sexual behaviors. So that's kind of my agenda for the day, and hopefully we're all on the same page and on the same slide. Uh-oh, let's see. I think I went one too far. I have a very sensitive mouth. So you'll look at this next strange slide because I put it up as kind of an idea to get us thinking that when we talk about normal, and I put that in quotes, or typical, we have to really consider a number of questions about what it means to be normal. Who decides what's normal? And I don't necessarily have the answers to these questions, but when we think about children and their behaviors, we need to think about who decides, where is it normal? Because across the world there are different kinds of practices, and even in the United States there are different kinds of behaviors that are acceptable or not acceptable depending on your community and your culture. When is it normal? So at what age is it normal? In what culture is it normal? And how many people have to do it before it becomes normal? Is it abnormal because it's in conflict with particular social norms or laws? Is it abnormal because it's not within a statistical average? A child's behavior falls outside of what could be graphed on a bell curve as kind of outside the middle, 68% on a bell curve. Is it abnormal because it's out of control and compulsive? Is it abnormal because it's contrary to one's own culture, even if it's normative in a more broad culture, or vice versa? Is it abnormal or atypical because it makes others feel uncomfortable or makes a particular individual feel uncomfortable? And I have a couple of examples of why that is important when we look at children's sexual behavior, because we have to look at it in terms of what is normative for the time and place that we are living in. So the first example is what's on this peculiar slide up here. These are 18th century devices that were used on little boys to keep them from masturbating at night. And the reason that they were put in these devices is because there was a belief at that time that the only psychiatric disorder that children and adults really could suffer from was insanity. And there was one primary cause for insanity. You guessed it. The primary cause that they believed of insanity was masturbation. And so they worked very hard to make sure that young boys in particular were not masturbating during the night. They also had practices that at this time and place we would find perhaps abusive, where they would tie the hands of children to the rails of their cribs so that they couldn't reach their genitalia. So clearly, there are practices and beliefs related to children's sexuality that change over space and time. Another example of that is that for those of you who are mental health professionals and familiar with the DSM, in the DSM-1 and 2, homosexuality was defined as a mental disorder, and that was on the books in the DSM through 1968. After that time, the DSM-3 included something called ego-dystonic sexual orientation, and that was in the DSM through the 1970s, leading to lots of perceptions about appropriate treatments and how homosexuality should be dealt with as an individual and in our society. So you can tell that things definitely change over time. So in summary, let's see if I can get my slide to advance. Oh, I'm having a little bit of trouble with the slides here, Tanya. Let's see if I can get this one to go. There we go. No, I'm backwards. Oh no, there we are. So we have to really think about what is normal or typical across individuals, across and within groups, across time, and a recognition that what is typical and normal is influenced by experience, environment, and culture. So the context is important. Okay. To start our specific conversation about our current time and space, I'm going to give you a case example. It's a case example from my actual practice that I saw this week. I had 4 girls who are all in 2nd and 3rd grade. And my task as a forensic interview specialist was to interview them and try and understand the source of their sexual behavior, and then for our team to be able to ascertain whether this was kind of typical behaviors that were occurring, or if the behaviors that were happening with this group of girls were kind of outside of the typical or normative experience of 2nd and 3rd graders. What was the source of their sexual knowledge? So these 4 2nd and 3rd graders had some mutual sexual activity, which was discovered after a teacher found a note in one of the girls' desks that said, "I want to play the game again. I can't wait for the slumber party. I love sex." So these are 7- and 8-year-old girls. Upon questioning by the teachers, the principal, and the parents, it was discovered that their sexual activity involved licking each other's breasts and licking each other's vaginas and inserting markers into their own vaginas. And that activity took place in several settings, including a shed at the school bathrooms, and some slumber parties. In nearly all the situations, a couple of the girls would participate, and then one would be kind of the lookout girl in case someone was coming. And in one of the parent interviews that we conducted, once this behavior was discovered and reported to both CPS and law enforcement, the parent interviews included information that at least one of the girls, kind of looking historically and retrospectively, one of the parents reported that one of the girls did not want to go to school for a week. She stayed home for a week with some psychosomatic behaviors, stomach aches, crying, and not wanting to go to school. And that, in retrospect, coincided kind of at the height of some of these games. So later on, we're going to take a look again at this case. You can bear that in mind. And we'll kind of take a look at the specific behaviors and how we might evaluate whether those behaviors are typical or atypical, and whether some of those behaviors may be red flags for considering child sexual abuse as a hypothesis. So as we go through, let's see if I can now, oh good, I can now advance with my space bar. So we want to start talking about human sexual development in general. Human sexual development actually begins before birth. There are all kinds of interesting videos and documentation, studies of babies in utero, where the baby girls have vaginal lubrication and the baby boys have erections. And what those videos tell us is that even before birth, our bodies are preparing for our human lifetime job of first being a sensual being, and then later, when it's age appropriate, being a sexual being. So we know that sexual development in children begins before birth. We know that it unfolds over time in a generally predictable way, like all other aspects of human development, unless there is something that intervenes and changes that trajectory. And as we'll talk about on Thursday, sexual abuse is one of those things that can intervene in what is otherwise a sort of generally predictable way of development unfolding. It can interrupt that trajectory. But in general, normative human sexual development unfolds over time, just like cognitive development and physical development. Most babies crawl before they stand before they walk, and the same is true in sexual development. Things typically unfold in a predictable way. However, like other forms of development, sexual development is highly individual. And that individual knowledge and development is influenced by the age, and also what the child observes and what the child is taught, both in their family and in society at large. But in summary, we know that young people, this is a quote from an article that's referenced in your bibliography at the end of the slides. Young people do not wake up on their 13th birthday somehow transformed into a sexual being overnight. Even young children are sexual in some form. So what we know about typical sexual behavior is that there are a number of domains for it, and it results in a number of different behaviors that are actually observable. And the different domains or aspects of childhood sexuality include biological and physiological development, sensual, the actual physical experience of touch, and in children that's more sensual. In adults it becomes more sexual or erotic. There's a behavioral aspect to it, which is really what we're going to be talking about and what is on your next upcoming slides, what you do and who you do it with. There's a gender aspect, so what someone's gender identity is and what roles they are taught as part of that gender by their family and society. There's cognitive aspect of children's sexual development, what they know, how they know it, and when they know it. And then there are also an emotional, relational, social aspects that they're learning as they go on. They're developing schema to understand the things that they observe, the things that they see, and the things that they're feeling. So when we think about typical sexual behavior in young children, and here I've defined young children as 0 to 5, what we see lots of, and this is as much of a checklist as you're going to get in this training. I'll give you some references later on. But we see young children doing a lot of sensory motor kinds of behaviors and a lot of kind of curious, exploratory, here's my body kind of behaviors. So very commonly we will see kids exploring and touching their private parts. And while that is very common, it isn't comfortable for all adults to observe or see. And so the messaging that kids get about a behavior that is very normative is just as important to their sexual development and what they're learning, thinking, and feeling as the sort of biological unfolding of this. We see kids removing their clothing and showing their private parts to others, trying to touch breasts of people, their own moms or other women. They're very interested in seeing other people when they're naked or in the bathroom and asking questions about bodies and bodily functions. They are very interested in showing off their little bodies, so it's very, very normative for kids at this age to run around without their clothes on, lift up their shirts, pull down their pants. They have no inhibitions because they haven't really internalized some of the behavioral norms that also unfold developmentally and over time. They don't understand about privacy in the ways that older kids would. If we saw some of those behaviors, like lifting up their shirt and pulling down their pants in a kid who's 12, we would then say it's not normative because that is something that also unfolds over time. What is happening in these early years is that it's a period of rapid physical growth and rapid sensory motor awareness. Their coordination increases, and what happens in infancy is that when that coordination increases, masturbation also increases because they can actually find their way to their genitalia. And so sometimes that masturbation in early childhood is for physical pleasure, not the same way that adults do. It's very rare for young children to masturbate to orgasm, though it is possible, it is very rare. But there's still a pleasurable aspect to touching one's genitalia when you're in this young age group. And sometimes children masturbate because it's a way of really self-soothing. In fact, there are countries in the world and cultures in the world where it's normative for adults to masturbate the genitalia of children because of the soothing aspect of it. That would be something probably in mainstream American culture that we would not find to be a normative behavior, but it does happen in other places in the world. So in infancy and young children, that sexual outlet, that sensory motor output, is primarily physical. But as I mentioned before, the child is learning a lot. The brain is rapidly developing, and the child is organizing and understanding schema about the world. One of the main things that is happening at this time in other domains of development that does relate to sexuality is attachment and the capacity to attach to someone else emotionally. And that's actually very, very tied into sexual behavior. It's an important piece for kids to be able to have in early childhood to enable them to grow up to have fulfilling relational and sexual relationship kind of experiences later in life. So we're going to move on to some of the typical sexual behavior in young school-age kids. So the sort of 5 to 8-ish. We continue to see masturbation. we continue to see this interest in seeing other people naked or in the bathroom. There's a lot of questions about bodies and bodily functions. There's a lot of bathroom talk. There's nothing more hilarious to a 6-year-old boy than pee-pee and poo-poo jokes. There's a lot of play acting about what kids observe. And so now that we have such full access to media in nearly every child's home with the internet, what they see is much more kind of older person, adult-like sexualized behavior on TV, on music videos, etc. So we are seeing some more play acting of things that maybe we wouldn't have seen a generation ago because kids have access to that kind of stimuli. And in this age group, we continue to see that exploration of others' bodies. Playing doctor, you show me yours, I'll show you mine. Let's see, there we go. As kids get into the later school years, we see some more of these things, but we also see kids really internalizing some of the messaging about sexuality, particularly the privacy kinds of things. Not only do kids understand that there are some things that they shouldn't be doing in public, but they also want their own privacy. They're not picking up their shirts and showing everybody their bodies. So they're still curious. There's still a lot of this looking at people are attempting to see what's normal, what do I look like compared to other people. But they're starting to really appreciate more of the social norms around those kinds of things. There's increasing exposure to sexual content in music, video games, TV, movies, and internet. And because at this point, children's worlds are becoming larger, they're going to school friends who parents may not know as well and who may have different norms about what is okay on TV, what is okay, amounts of computer time, et cetera. Their world is getting bigger and they're being exposed to more kinds of stimuli and information. There is the beginning of curiosity about actual sexual, more erotic kinds of behaviors. So for some kids, this is the budding of romantic and sexual attraction to peers. There's maybe some exploration of others' bodies, particularly in these older years, and curiosity about the sexual behaviors of adults. And part of that is the stimuli that I've talked about, and part of it is the general unfolding. But we see those kinds of curiosities, interests, and experimentation occurring earlier, not only because of the stimuli from society and the media, but also because kids' bodies are kind of biochemically signaling them earlier. If we were doing this webinar, which wouldn't be possible, but if we were doing the webinar 100 years ago, we really wouldn't be talking about kids in this age group beginning puberty. But we actually are seeing that in this later school-age population. Puberty is beginning on average 4 years earlier than it did a century ago. So the average onset of a girl's period now is 11 to 12, whereas a century ago it was 15 to 16. And same thing, boys' appearance of puberty is also advanced about 4 years. And so kids are getting messages from their own bodies about sexual interest as well. The other thing that is happening in this age group, and we know this, there's not a lot of studies in childhood about this, but there are retrospective studies and reports from adults, that it is actually during these years that adults who later identify as lesbian, gay, transgendered, questioning, that these are the years that they report starting to notice feeling different than the majority of their peers. So they kind of report retrospectively that these are the years that they felt different, they had different attractions. And so we look backwards at this time in life as not the coming out time, but the time of first awareness for some adults. They report that this is the time of first awareness. There has not been tons and tons of studies about normative childhood sexuality, but the sort of landmark study that came out in 1998 by an author called William Friedrich, and some of his citations are at the end of your webinar PowerPoint slides, but there's lots of places on the internet to download this particular article. Here's the site where I downloaded it just this week in preparation for the webinar. And basically what he did was he put together basically a sample of normative behaviors in children ages 2 to 12. And he grouped them into categories based on parent report about what they were seeing. And then he turned it into an actual administrable tool that later became a tool. I'll talk about that. I think it's later in this webinar, or perhaps next Thursday. He turned it into an actual screening tool that mental health professionals can utilize to help screen for sexual abuse-related kinds of behaviors. But this original study was just looking at how often did certain kinds of sexual behaviors appear in a typically developing group of children where they screened out the possibility of sexual abuse to the best of anybody's ability. So these are normally developing kids who have not had any interruption in their sexual development trajectory because of sexual abuse. And what he did was he took his entire population. I think the total N was about 300 kids in this original study. And he looked at males and females, and what was pretty astounding was how much sexual behavior there actually is in kids. And that was an important thing to be able to talk about and make sexual curiosity and behavior kind of normative. And just as an example, for the boys, and this is also the other thing that this study did, is helped us really confirm that sexual development and behavior does change over time, that it is normative and unfolding, both in terms of new interests appearing and also certain behaviors diminishing with age. So he does endorse 38 different items. I'm not going to cover all 38, but just to give you an example, for the boys, touching sex parts in public, of all the boys, this was very common in 2 to 5-year-olds, decreasing in 6 to 9-year-olds, and almost absent, touching sex parts in public, in 10 to 12-year-old boys. Masturbating with a toy or object, not hugely common, but it was there in a group of non-abused children, and that also decreased over time. Putting mouth on sex parts, almost invisible, even in the very early ages. So that was one of the things that turned out in his later study to be kind of a red flag. If that is a behavior that kids are engaging in, it's more associated with kids who are more of a clinical sample and not a typical sample. So that was the other thing that this study did. Touching sex parts at home, huge numbers in the early years, diminishing somewhat in school age, and by 10 to 12, not noticed by parents. That doesn't mean it's not happening, but the kids are internalizing those privacy rules, so parents, this is a whole parent report study, are less able to endorse those items. Putting objects in the rectum and vagina, almost non-existent, even in the very young kids, and not endorsed at all by parents, observing that in the school years and the 10 to 12 age group. So very similar numbers. They shuffle out a little bit differently with the girls, but kind of similar things. The same common behaviors are touching sex parts in public that decrease over the years. Masturbating with a toy or object, actually more common in the girls and still present throughout those years of 2 to 12 in a non-abused population. But that was for masturbating with a toy or object. But actually putting objects up inside the vagina and rectum, there for younger kids, not endorsed in the later years. So if anybody has an interest in that particular article, you have the website for looking at that and really getting a sense. And it really, really contributed to our understanding of what kids are actually doing. So when we try and synthesize what those kind of research articles and clinical observations of children see, normative sexual play between children sort of follows a number of patterns. The first one is that it seems to occur mostly between children who know each other well. So it doesn't so much occur between strangers or between kids who are just, on their first play date. There seems to be more of an idea among kids that this is something that you do just with somebody that you know well. Generally, normative sexual exploration and play occurs between children of the same general age, developmental stage, physical size, and status. So I always get the question when I'm doing a more interactive training, what does same general age mean? And there isn't universal agreement on this, but in the pre-puberty years, general same age is somewhere around 3 years. We get, our eyebrows get raised if we've got a 10-year-old and a 5-year-old, or a 12-year-old and an 8-year-old, because they're really not at the same developmental stage anymore. But because there's so much individual variability, a separation of about 3 years is not uncommon, especially among kids that know each other well. So normative sexual play between kids is also lighthearted, spontaneous, non-coercive. There's no threats involved. It's actually fun. It's curiosity-based. It's normative if it's the kinds of things that they might be curious about developmentally and culturally. It's infrequent, so it's not the only thing that kids play together. They're also at school in the block corner, and they're also riding bikes, and they're also playing house, and they're also playing school. So it's not compulsive or preoccupied. It's voluntary. So kids are doing this because it's fun, it's lighthearted, and if caught, they generally don't exhibit discomfort, shame, or emotional distress. They might get embarrassed or feel that they were being naughty, but they're not really shamed about what they were doing. And because of that, it usually responds to adult intervention, diversion, or redirection. Those are, if we see those qualities to the sexual play between kids, it is something that usually we aren't concerned about clinically. It may be that parents want to intervene, but from a clinical point of view or concern about kids' exposure to sexual abuse or other kind of adult sexual material, we're not usually concerned about it if it's within those parameters. Whoops, I think I might have gone one too far. Let's see. I'm going to go back one slide. So hopefully everybody's on atypical behaviors in childhood. So what gets us more concerned, what raises our eyebrows, is when we see children engaging in behaviors that are beyond what we would typically see for a particular developmental stage or typical knowledge. And again, it doesn't mean that children have necessarily been sexually abused. It means they've been exposed to some way in some material that is more typical for a different developmental stage or adulthood. So for example, I've had a number of cases over my years where early elementary school kids are kind of caught in school bathrooms trying to engage others in oral sex. What we want to know about that is, how did they learn about that? Whose idea was that? Where did they get that information? Because what we're concerned about is how much material they're being exposed to, whether it's purposeful or accidental that they're being exposed to adult or older person sexual imagery, or whether something has actually happened to them and they are kind of reenacting a personal experience. So if we see something that's beyond sort of normative developmental stage and knowledge, we want to know more about where the child learned about that kind of behavior. We're concerned if there's any coercion, threats, or force. So, you know, maybe on a continuum, I'm not going to be your friend if is a pretty common kind of a thing, but I'm going to get you in trouble, I'm going to hurt you, I'm going to tell on you, I'm going to get you in trouble kinds of things, or anything that's physically forceful, we would be very concerned about. Our eyebrows would be raised significantly. When there's a significant age, size, or power differential, I think we mentioned this just a few minutes ago, that is something that we're concerned about. And from a legal point of view, there are actually age gaps that are defined in case law and are of concern to us. So if there's any significant age, size, or power differential, we want to make note of that, and as we'll talk about later in the webinar, it may be something that's reportable as well. Something that evokes emotional distress or strong reactions in a child is something that is no longer playful, spontaneous, and lighthearted. If kids are really feeling shame or distress about the kinds of activities that they're engaging in or that somebody else is asking them to engage in, it raises a red flag for us. If it's something that occurs with high frequency, so if kids are not in the block corner, if they're either sitting in a corner and masturbating and it's just them, or there's just persistent sexual behavior, they keep getting, sneaking off and kind of getting caught, and it's to the kind of the exclusion of other kinds of socially appropriate activities, we're concerned about that. If it interferes with their own development or, as I mentioned, associated with their own internal emotional distress, we get worried. And the last thing is if parents report to us, look, this keeps happening, and they're at an age where they really should understand about privacy and they really don't, or they're at an age where they really should have other kinds of social interests and this keeps coming up and they're not responding when I try and intervene or redirect, those are things, again, that are red flags. There are some clinical definitions and tools that are available to professionals to help further understand this. And there was an outstanding report, which is also available online. It's produced by an organization, ATSA, A-T-S-A, the Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers. It was an interesting organization to engage in this project. But what they wanted to understand was, at what point did juvenile sexual behavior become problematic? So to start, they defined what was typical sexual behavior, and some of the material that we've already covered is from that report. But they also helped to really put together a definition of what in the clinical literature in kids 12 and younger is called childhood sexual behavior problems. So their definition is that it involves children ages 12 and younger. It involves behaviors with sexual body parts, and those behaviors are developmentally inappropriate or potentially harmful, either emotionally or physically. They can be self-focused, so just kids and their own sexual behaviors, or they can involve others. And they're very clear that while they use the term sexual, the motivation for behaviors in children this age is not always sexual in the way that we think about these things as adults. The motivation may be more curiosity, and it's expressed inappropriately. It may be because of anxiety. It may be because they're imitating something. They're sexually self-soothing, or they are sexually reactive. They're kind of reenacting. Kids use play all the time to try and understand things in the world around them and experiences that they've had. If they go on a vacation to, I don't know, Disneyland, they're coming back and they're playing the ride in Disneyland. Sometimes kids do the same thing with sexual experiences that have happened. So they're trying to understand them by playing about them and acting them out. So the motivation is not necessarily sexual, erotic, the way that we think about it in adulthood, but the motivation for those things can be much more multifaceted in childhood. Whoops, advanced one too many. When kids under 12 and under actually have problematic sexual behaviors, they are really multifaceted in origin. They can come from familial and social kinds of experiences that they've had. They can come from other developmental factors, and they can also come from economic factors. And what they mean by that in the ATSA report is that because of the socioeconomics of some families, there are adults and older children all sleeping in the same room, and there just may be exposure because not everybody has a separate bedroom. Not everybody goes to the bathroom in private. So there is exposure to other kinds of behaviors or knowledge that may happen purely because there aren't enough places for people to have privacy. The other thing that is really important is that the development of sexual behavior problems in children is as commonly related to, and maybe even more related to, other kinds of psychosocial stressors, and not just exposure to sexual inappropriate material or activity. So physical abuse and neglect, family violence, and substandard parenting practices are associated with some of the sexual behavior problems that kids have. And those of anybody who's working, for example, in a population, a child welfare population, and see kids in care, in foster care or residential care, we sometimes see kids clinging to each other because they didn't get the attachments and the emotional needs met, and they cling to each other. And sometimes some of that becomes almost more sexual in nature. It's more sensual, not sexual, but we see kids, because of exposure to other kinds of things, kind of clinging to other kids. The other thing that we see, and this will be true when we talk on Thursday about how does somebody become an adult sexual abuser, problematic psychosocial behaviors, including sexual behavior problems in children and adolescents, are sometimes more associated with exposure to domestic violence and physical abuse and neglect in their history than they are actual sexual experiences. The other piece that the ATSA report discusses in great detail is that while sexually abused kids have a higher frequency of sexual behavior problems, many kids without a sexual abuse history have sexual behavior problems. And that really just underscores the multifaceted pathways that somebody might end up with a sexual behavior problem. It's not just because they've been sexually abused, but it's exposure to other kinds of things. And conversely, kids who are sexually abused are not universally having sexual behavior problems. So while it is a red flag, and we want to consider what is the source, what is the origin of the sexual behavior problem, and we want to rule out sexual abuse as one of the pathways, many kids without a sexual abuse history have sexual behavior problems, and many kids with a sexual abuse history do not have sexual behavior problems. So it's not diagnostic. The only normed, for those of you who are mental health professionals, the only normed tool for looking at sexual behavior problems in relationship to sexual abuse is a tool called the Child Sexual Behavior Inventory, and it's the same author as the study we described earlier, William Friedrich. And he's written a couple of articles which are available to look at using this particular tool and its findings. So again, it's not a diagnosis of sexual abuse. There is no such thing, but if certain items are endorsed in greater frequency, they occur clinically more often in a population of kids who have been sexually abused than they do in a normative non-abused population, and also more often than a population of other psychiatrically involved kids that don't have a history of sexual abuse. So if that's an interest of yours, there are the resources for it. In that survey, in this inventory, sexualized behavior is the most frequent symptom that distinguishes an sexually abused population from a non-sexually abused population, but sexual behavior problems are generally found in only about 40% of kids who have a sexual abuse history. 60% of them are not presenting with sexual behavior kinds of problems. So I'm going to summarize briefly the sexual development in childhood, and we're going to look for a few minutes at adolescence, and then we'll hopefully by about 11:30 move on to our question and answer time. So sexual development in childhood, some of the consensus is that sexual curiosity, interest, and experimentation is progressive over time. that sexual development is affected by a number of external variables: the sexual values of families and cultures, environment, exposure to material, exposure to behaviors. We're in agreement that children seem to be having sexual experiences at earlier ages, partly because of some of the biochemical changes that are advancing the age of puberty, and partly because of media exposure and just general broader world exposure than occurred in previous generations. And there's also a consensus that consensual, age-appropriate sexual play between peers is neither harmful nor traumatic to children. It's part of their normative sexual trajectory. And we've covered, and I'm happy to answer more questions about some of the atypical pieces, but this is kind of a brief summary of what happens more typically in childhood. We're going to move on to adolescence. And the thing with adolescence is that their behavior is frankly all over the map. So it's impossible to look at a particular behavior and know whether that is a red flag for something that is not normative in this age group. Unlike when we look at that age group of 2 to 12-year-olds and we have clinical tools and observations about things that kind of appear in greater numbers or lower numbers. In adolescence, there are some kids who are completely sexually uninterested and uninvolved and won't be until much later in adolescence and middle adolescence or even later adolescence. And we've got some youth who even in early adolescence are very interested in sexual activity and also very active sexually with more than one partner. And while that may be of concern, it's not necessarily developmentally unexpected or unheard of. And I want to review something that we didn't talk about in great detail earlier, which is that while sexual development does unfold in a developmental trajectory over time, there's also a lot of individual variation, and people come into the world pre-wired in different ways to have more or less interest in sexuality. So, and this is true throughout the lifespan. It's also true into adulthood. But in adolescence, it presents, and kids, their primary concern in life, let's see if this is on the next slide. I think it's on the one right after that. Their primary concern in adolescence is, am I normal? So what is everybody else doing? What is everybody else thinking? What is everybody else wondering about is a primary concern to them, and actually puts a lot of pressure on those kids who are developing slower. It's still unfolding in a predictable way, but it's happening later, just like getting your teeth happens later, or just like walking happens later. For those kids who are less interested in sexuality, they just came into the world in that way, they are wondering, am I okay? What's wrong with me? And the same thing is true because of all of the physical changes that are happening in this age group. It's really nice to be in that middle. Again, when we sort of think about development on a bell curve, you can graph all kinds of human development on a bell curve, and that middle 68% is kind of in the norm, and things are starting to happen to them more or less between the ages of 11 to 14. But if you're one of those kids where things are starting to happen a lot earlier or a lot later, it's of concern to you, the child. It's also of concern to the parents sometimes. But some of the psychosocial risks are actually associated with kids on the outer ends of that bell curve. So either kids who are really, really concerned about their lack of development or lack of interest and think that there's something wrong with them, or on the other end, the kids that are very interested and very developing early before they're emotionally ready to cope with the consequences of sexual involvement. They kind of get into some high-risk behaviors because their just emotional and cognitive development has not caught up with what's happening physically. So what is happening physically is puberty. And puberty is basically defined in girls as officially as the onset of their period, and for boys officially it's defined as their first ejaculation, often in boys at nighttime, and nocturnal emission. But the signs of puberty start to happen about 2 years before that official coming of age. And lots of things are happening, physical development. So with girls, the kinds of things that you will see about 2 years before they get their periods is the appearance of body hair and breast budding. That can happen in kids really very commonly as young as 9, and it's only considered of concern, like early onset puberty, if it happens before the age of 8, so 7 and under. We see lots and lots of kids developing breast buds at 8 and 9 years old. And again, think about that, of what it means cognitively and emotionally. They're just really not ready for getting attention and kind of focusing on those kinds of things. And so that's where psychosocial risk can appear, because what's happening physically doesn't necessarily jive with what's happening emotionally and cognitively. In adolescence, there's a lot of that mismatch, that the physical maturity does not correlate with the emotional maturity. The other thing that's happening, and this is really a very interesting area of research that I don't feel particularly expert in, but the pieces of it that I will pass on to you that I do think is important for most professionals working with kids to at least have an appreciation for, is how much research is emerging about brain development. And while many kids, many adolescents, will be finished with their physical development, some of them by 15 and 16 years old, we now know that the brain development continues to go on into the early 20s. And it's important to understand when we're thinking about both sexual development and also sexual risk-taking that happens in adolescence and sexual abuse of adolescence, because that lack of jiving between physical development and what is happening in the brain helps explain why adolescents are at the highest risk for sexual abuse and assault of any age group. So why high school students and college students are at greater risk for sexual assault than any other age group, and also why adolescents are responsible in those years for a pretty substantial number of sexual abuse and sexual assault, I'll put this in quotes, perpetration, because their brain is not functioning as an adult. It is not correctly anticipating the consequences of their behaviors. And so from the victim side of things, kids get involved in risk-taking situations because they just are unable to really kind of think past the logical extension of their behaviors. And conversely, kids are not thinking through necessarily the consequences of what will happen when they do something impulsively. They're not engaging the part of the brain that is responsible for that more advanced thinking. The frontal lobe is the largest part of the brain, and a small area of it is called the prefrontal cortex. And that is basically the CEO of the body that controls our thoughts, that prioritizes thoughts, that helps us think in the abstract, anticipate consequences, and plan and control our impulses. And that part of the brain does not finish developing until into the 20s. So I'll give you an example of a case that I had just the last couple of weeks. It involved a girl and 2 boys. And at the beginning, we weren't sure if the sexual behavior between this 16-year-old girl and 2 male peers, was consensual or not. It did turn out to be consensual. But one of the boys, without the permission of the girl, did start videotaping the sexual activity between the girl and the other boy. So he took out his phone, he videoed her giving the other boy a blowjob in the school bathroom, and he basically sent it to everyone that he knew. They are all peers, they're 11th and 12th graders at school, but the boy that videotaped is 18. He's on a high school campus with 16 and 17-year-olds. And so he has actually been arrested, and he's been charged as an adult because he's 18 for this surreptitious videotaping of her and the sending of it. And there is no way, I mean, the detectives have already interviewed him, there's no way that he anticipated the consequences of that incredibly stupid and impulsive act on his life. But kids of this age do not think that way. They're in the moment, and when we talk about sexual behavior, both on the victim end, the perpetration end, and also just the regular, plain old, adolescent between each other kind of sexual behavior, they're not really anticipating the outcome of some of their decisions. The other piece, well, I'll get to that in a minute. So what are they doing? What are they actually doing? There's a huge range, both in their physical maturity and development and in the sexual behaviors that they're engaging in, from abstinence to experimentation with adult-like sexual behaviors. It's happening all over the map from around the age of 12 all the way up into later adolescence. What we know is that what they know does not always translate into what they do. So, for example, you can ask any 17-year-old, how do you get pregnant? They know the answer. You can ask them, how can you prevent a pregnancy or an STD? And they all know that you can take birth control or you can use a condom. And when we then go and we talk to kids about what they did, what they're actually doing, only about 60% of them will say that they used a condom during their last sexual activity, their last intercourse, despite the fact that they know that that would be important in preserving their health and preventing STDs and pregnancy. Their romantic relationships can be frequent and unstable. Some would argue continuing into adulthood for all of us, but certainly in adolescence, there's a lot of experimentation, not just sexually, but also in trying to figure out who they are and what they feel. It's the time when the formulation of their sexual identity and orientation is crystallizing, and it is a time where some kids who, not all, many wait until into adulthood to come out. Some never come out, but it's not an uncommon time for kids who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and questioning to come out. It's also not uncommon for kids not to come out and to have that part of their life feel like it has to be very secret and covert. And for that reason, it's a very high-risk period for that population of teens. And it's high risk for a couple of reasons. One is, and it's not an unsubstantial number of kids, somewhere between 5 and 10% of teens will identify as LGBTQ. And the reason that it's a high-risk period is because that population of kids is at much greater risk than their heterosexual counterparts for bullying, sexual assault, and hate crimes, particularly in schools. They are 4 times as likely to attempt suicide as their heterosexual peers. And the other thing that we are seeing, at least clinically, is that because many of these kids have to hide their sexual orientation for safety or other reasons from their peers at school and their families, that some of them are experimenting and trying to figure out who they are and how they feel with strangers. About 1/4 of them will say that they have had sexual experimentation with a stranger, and that I'm sure we all can understand what some of the potential risks there are. But at the time in adolescence, it seems safer for some kids than coming out. So it's a very high-risk period for that population of kids. Whoops. I have to be more patient with the slides advancing. Sorry about that. Okay, so what are they actually doing? The next couple of slides are collected from the YRBS, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. It's a self-report of high school students across the country reporting on what they do, not just related to sexual behavior, but to all different kinds of behavior. I've just extracted the sexual data, and it was first tracked in 1997. So if anyone is interested, the citation on the bottom of the slide tracks changes from 1997 through 2011, the last time the data was collected. And a few of the things that the YRBS tracks, and by the way, I've put in the title of the slide, it's trends among heterosexual adolescents. They're not tracking There's no really good data source on LGBTQ youth. So the questions are kind of across the board about have you had intercourse and things like that. So it doesn't distinguish between heterosexual and gay lesbian behaviors. 46% of high school students report having had sexual intercourse. 14% of high school students report having had sexual intercourse with 4 or more persons. 61% used a condom, which means 40% didn't during their last sexual intercourse, despite what they know. And a really significant concern, because this tracks risk among kids, is that 22% of them used alcohol or drugs in conjunction with their last sexual intercourse. And if we look at the next slide, there's additional information on that. Among currently sexually active students, almost 26% of them report using drugs or alcohol during their last intercourse. And 35% of adolescents say that alcohol or drugs has at some point influenced their decision to do something sexual. So that is something that people who are in my business, but I think really in anybody's business who works with youth and teens, has to really appreciate that alcohol and drugs combine in a lot of adolescent risk-taking behaviors, including their sexual behaviors. And it is quite a significant risk factor for sexual assault in this age group. And just so we're clear, in California, it is, in most states, but I'm more familiar with California law, an individual cannot consent to sexual behavior if they are drunk or high. So if they're too influenced by alcohol or drugs to be able to actually say, yes, this is okay with me, there's more factors that go into consent. But if they really are too high to be able to have done that, then someone is committing a crime. And so again, when we think about risk-taking, not anticipating the consequences, being a victim, and also potentially being a perpetrator of a crime, it's a really high-risk issue. And so those of you who are out there who are in a more of a community educator role, it's one of the really important frontiers, I think, for sexuality education with this age group. The other thing, this is not on the YRBS, but I pulled it off of some other citations, is people are often curious about sexting behavior with this population. And it seems to actually be going down a little bit. The Pew Institute did a study in 2009 where they looked at actual sexting, where there's somebody sending naked photos of a minor that would legally constitute child porn. It's showing some of the intimate parts of the body. And in 2009, about 15% of teens said that they had sexted. The University of New Hampshire did a study in 2011, and that kind of more full child pornography sexting was down to about 2.5, but they found that when they just expanded the definition to be more sexually provocative kinds of sexting, that the number was up around 10%. So those are some of the behaviors. There's a few more slides here that you can look at. The one bullet point that I really want to bring people's attention to is the second one on this slide. More than 1 in 10 girls who had first intercourse before the age of 15 describe it as non-voluntary, and many more describe it as relatively unwanted. And this is one of the things that we continue to find in the clinical populations of kids, that the younger kids have their first intercourse, the more likely it is to be non-voluntary, coercive, or unwanted. All right. I'm going to just come to our summary slide. You can look at some of those other bullet points. So the summary of adolescent development is that adolescence is a time of change. Kids get very mixed messages during these years about their roles and about sexuality, and they're mixed legally as well. You can't consent to sex with an older person or you're a victim. You can't have sex with a younger person or you're an offender. There's all kinds of mixed messages about what they should be doing, should not be doing, and the messages are sometimes not congruent between what they hear and think about in their family or their community from what they're seeing on TV. The different spheres of development are also in conflict, so they may understand right or wrong, but the moment current situation often has greater influence on decision making. And the final piece is that, and this actually just for time, I have the slide here, but we're going to talk about this more on Thursday. They engage in risky sexual behaviors for many of the same reasons that they engage in other kinds of risky behaviors, because of those changes in brain development. So again, we'll talk about this on Thursday, but juveniles are responsible for not a small amount of sexual assaults. But the very interesting thing is that just like they age out of other inappropriate and risk-taking behaviors, such as drunk driving or other kinds of, crimes that peak in the late teens and early 20s, by the time the brain development kicks in, those other crimes also decrease in this population, and so does adolescent risk-taking behavior that is legally defined as sexually assaultive or illegal sexual kinds of behaviors. They age out of that like they do any other kind of risk-taking behavior, and we will talk about that more next time. I'm just going to point you to the slides, and then Tanya, you can get ready to do whatever you need to do technologically for us to be able to answer the questions. The last few slides are references and recommended reading. So if you have access to books and libraries, there's a couple of articles and books here. But the couple of websites I want to point you to are the NCTSN website, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. They have a great fact sheet on general sexual development and behavior, and also atypical, what to do about that, especially if you work with parents. There's a very inexpensive booklet available for $2.50, written by Tony Kavanaugh Johnson, Understanding Children's Sexual Behaviors, What's Normal and Healthy, and it's available in both English and Spanish and appropriate for both professionals and parents if you work with parents. And SICUS, the Sexuality Information and Education Council of the United States, has many, many interesting fact sheets. And finally, the ATSA report that was published in 2006 on children with sexual behavior problems is available online, and I checked to make sure that you could still download it this week, and there's the website. So Tanya, I think we're ready for Q&A.
Great, thank you, Miriam. I just want to point everyone into the question area. I just provided a link that has a Word document, and it includes all the links that were on the slide that you weren't able to click through. And it also has a download link for a copy of the slides that we watched today, reviewed today. So let's get started with the Q&A area. I'm just going to start at the top. And we had a question about, is normative sex play present within siblings?
Oh, what a great question. So, and before Thursday, I can also try and just get a couple of online references for that question. So normative sibling sex play actually follows the patterns of other kinds of sex play between kids. So it would not be uncommon at all to have a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old who are in the bathtub together still and poking and showing, and I'll show me yours if you show me mine, and kind of goofy, lighthearted, spontaneous kinds of behavior. It really does follow the patterns of other kinds of sexual behavior between children who know each other well. The same kinds of red flags would apply. Kids have not internalized the incest taboo that adults have internalized. So by the time they have internalized other social taboos, and they realize that most people are not talking about how hot their sister is, they're talking about how hot the boy in their 6th grade class is, that the kind of, poking and curiosity kind of behaviors will diminish between siblings kind of naturally. When the privacy kicks in, they may have been fine sharing a bathroom before, or even being in the bathtub or shower, but at some point, kind of naturally, as they internalize some of those other social norms, any kind of privacy and, kind of other kinds of normative norms will start to kick in with the sibling population as well. If they don't, by the time that you would expect to see that in normal normally developing, typically developing kids, that could be a red flag. But especially in early childhood and early school age, it's not at all atypical for kids to have that same kind of experimentation and curiosity, and to have families who deal with that in a myriad of different ways. Some are more comfortable and some are less comfortable, but families are responsible for suggesting to kids what the norms and rules and boundaries are in the particular family. I hope that answers the question. If it doesn't, please send something else in.
Great, thank you. The second question is, someone asked, can you briefly talk about sexual behavior for children who are developmentally behind, such as Asperger's or autism?
Yeah. So in general, for those kids, the trajectory will also unfold on a timetable. And just like some of the other developmental domains are affected, so the social, emotional, the cognition, that influences how kids will make sexual behavior decisions as well when they have some kind of special needs. So there, and the other thing I'll say about that, I'll come back to in general in a minute. The other thing is that, you know, most kids as they go through their school years begin to get some sexuality education in school. So for most of the school districts that I'm familiar with, puberty education, for example, starts in 5th grade and continues through middle school and into high school. That is not always true with a special ed population. I think there's a lot of discomfort in people discussing sexuality with kids that have some special needs. And I think it's really sad and really a mistake, because those kids, even more than others, need actual cognitive teaching about how to manage some of the feelings and impulses that they might have. So in general, the behaviors will follow a trajectory that is similar, but the problem is that for that population of kids, because of the other cognitive and social emotional challenges that they have, they're not starting to internalize the social norms and messages or appropriateness of their behaviors in the same way that a typically developing child would. So they need some additional support and direct education about what's happening to their body and what is okay and not okay. And just as an example, we talked about in the early years, it's really typical for kids to grab at women's breasts. That we're typically seeing aging out by the time kids are early school age. But a child with Asperger's or autism or some other special need that influences their impulsivity and how they perceive the world and social rules doesn't necessarily develop that naturally. They have to be expressly taught. Okay, I'm done. The other thing
I had to turn my phone back on really quick. Sorry.
That's okay. I just want to make sure as people get their questions answered, that because I obviously can't see people's faces and get nods and things, whether I'm accurately understanding and responding to the question. So again, please feel free, if I don't nail your question, to make sure that you send something else in. Great.
So I have a couple questions that are pretty specific, so I'm going to leave those for email. And I'm going to focus on kind of the general questions. So there was actually a couple people who wanted to know a little bit more about how this case study wrapped up that you talked about in the beginning.
I forget to mention that. I'm really sorry. So I hate to leave everybody hanging, but we are still in the middle of interviewing and investigating. The one young lady that I've interviewed so far, there was a question about whether she was kind of patient zero, if you will, whether it was she. I like to think about kids that engage in these as the child whose idea it was. So in no way do we apply perpetrator language to young children. If there really is a problem, we use the term child with sexual behavior problem. In adolescence, the sort of term that's in vogue right now is adolescents who engage in illegal sexual behavior, so that they're adolescents first, understanding the developmental issues that are going on that may be propelling that. I personally, when I deal with kids who are young, I like to use the term the child whose idea it was, because really what the main purpose is trying to understand how they got that idea if it seems developmentally not normative, and addressing the messaging that is propelling this behavior. So whether it's personal experience of child sexual abuse or exposure to adult-like sexual material. So now I'll come back to your specific question. So I've only interviewed one out of the 4 girls so far. The rest are scheduled for this week and next week. And so it's a little bit of a work in progress. But the first young lady turns out likely not to be the child whose idea it was. She was appropriately embarrassed, but not really feeling shame about what happened. There was behavior that is not really typically normed. I was less concerned actually about the markers on themselves, the inserting of markers into the vagina, than I was about the putting mouth on private parts on each other's vaginas, because that is something that we don't see too often in this age group. And I really want to understand more when we try and discover who the child was whose idea it is. And I think after this first interview and the parent interviews, we have a good idea about who that is, and she's coming in. So that will be kind of the most important piece of it. What was of most concern with the young lady that I interviewed so far is that piece when she was really sick to her stomach and not wanting to go to school. And so now that this story is out, it's really about her not wanting to participate in this game and feeling pressured and coerced. So that's the piece that we're most concerned about for her, that we want to get her some support and help with, and that we want to get the parents support and help with. For the most part, these parents, it seems from the parent interviews that have been conducted, have all been really great and are all really just mostly concerned about the origin of the idea and wanting to get their kids some information and education about their bodies that they're obviously more curious about than the parents initially realized. But at least one of the parents, in trying to extract the information, and I think there's an important lesson here to us as professionals and also professionals who work with parents, is that the parents so desperately wanted to get information about how this happened that the parent said, if you don't tell me what happened, CPS is going to get involved and they're going to take you away from me because they're going to think I'm not a good mommy. So, we really, if parents are involved in these things, we as professionals really can do a great service to the families by helping parents respond when things like this come up. They don't automatically know what to do. It's kind of alarming. They're concerned, obviously, and they want to get to the bottom of things. So those are the things we're working on with the first young lady, and the puzzle about whose idea it was is as yet to be uncovered.
Great. Thank you. There's actually a question kind of regarding that as well, and that is, what is the best manner an adult can react when observing child expelling and touching private parts without affecting children's normal sexual development? So
That's another great question.
Yeah.
So I don't have a perfect answer to that because I don't want to intrude on individual families' belief systems, because there are many, many things in our individual families, religions, and cultures that influence how we view children's sexual behaviors. So for, example, norms about nudity, norms about how much we talk about sex and sexuality in our families, those are very, very family specific, and I don't want to intrude and say this is right or this is wrong. What I really encourage parents to do, and what I really encourage families, professionals to help families do, is make note of something that they're observing or make note of something that's being talked about or overheard, and not feel pressured to address it in the moment. So if it's you stumble in and you walk in on 2 5-year-olds in the bedroom and their clothes are off and they're playing doctor, so to kind of redirect and distract and say, you know what, this is not what so-and-so came over for a play date for. Let's all put on clothes and go to the backyard and play catch. and just really redirect. For most kids, that redirection and that being caught is going to be enough. And then to buy a little bit of time to address this with your own child, let the other parent educate their child as they see fit about what they were curious about, and not to feel pressure to have every single answer at the moment, to always say to kids, I see why you were curious about that. And that's a really good question, and I got to think about that. Or if this is something that's really hard for a parent to talk about, to say, that's a really good question. And sometimes moms and dads get kind of goofy and embarrassed too about talking about this stuff. So I need to kind of think about how to answer your question, or to address what I saw. I just need some more time to kind of think about it. But the most important thing is not to have kids feel guilty or shamed about what it was that they were doing, and to provide, take a breath and provide some information to them when you feel ready, when you feel prepared. The only thing I'd add to that for right now is, if the behavior itself was very alarming, and developmentally inappropriate, like if you walked in on your kid giving a blowjob to another kid and they're both 6, then again, you want to not lose your cool. You want to separate and distract and redirect to a different behavior. And if you're a parent who's out, I'm not sure who's asking this, but if you're a parent, this is a really appropriate thing to get some consultation with, to call a counselor, to call somebody at the school that you trust who knows about normative sexual behavior, and to try and figure out what the source of the idea was. And I think that's a really appropriate question for parents to be able to ask, without blaming, without shaming, just to say, you remember when I walked in on so-and-so, and these are the things that I saw, and it's really, really important that you tell me about how you know about that, about how you got that idea. And the answer to that question, both for parents and for professionals, is going to help us direct whether a child just needs an avenue to express and explore curiosity and answer their questions with their parents, or whether some kind of professional consultation is in order.
Great. So we have just under 3 minutes left, and I wanted to just make sure that we finished up today. Any questions that haven't been answered so far today, we will be able to answer either by email if we feel that's appropriate, or we can bring it back on our next session on Thursday. So I want to just thank everyone for attending today. Just a reminder, our next session is next Thursday, same time, and you did need a separate registration. Unfortunately, it was my first time using our registration system, and I didn't know how to get it to do both at the same time. So you do need to register for both. If you haven't registered for Thursday's session, please go to our website and do that today. We will be sending out a link or a follow-up email shortly, probably within 24 hours, and it will have a link for an evaluation that you can take. If you take the evaluation, you will be able to get the link for the slides to download, and you also will be able to download a certificate of attendance for today. So please take a moment to provide us with feedback before the next session. And just a reminder, if you need CEUs for the sessions, you need to attend or view the recordings of both today's and the 14th sessions. And following that, you'll receive an application for the CEUs. So again, if you have any other questions, please make sure, if you haven't put them in the question area here, which does record the questions, that you email them to me, and we will be able to get you those questions back. So I want to thank everyone again for coming, and we'll talk to you soon. Thank you. Thank you, Miriam.
Thank you, Tanya.